Hello folks, the launch of Season 2 this week brought with it the opening of the new raid and the launch of the Race to World First, meaning that for the more competitive players, their wait for content is over. The launch was accompanied with a couple of things that have become a bit of a tradition for seasonal launches, including the first look at the next patch, 11.105, yes, already, and a much less desirable one for players, which this time has had a pretty unfortunate impact on the Race to World First, so stay tuned for what's going to be a pretty chunky news update. With Season 2 now up and running, we're all able to dive into the new Mythic Plus dungeons, more lucrative delves, and of course the raid. The launch of the raid came with the next installment of the War Within campaign questline, which has turned out to be surprisingly large in its scope, beginning with the loss of an important character, only to then discover that things are most decidedly going wrong for Xal'atath, and ultimately leaving us to deal with Scallywick. This provided what is probably the most satisfying mid-expansion patch storyline ever. The first part of the raid takes place in a copy of the Undermine zone itself, which serves to make it dovetail into the main story quite nicely, and I personally found the encounters to be consistently good fun. But it's when we get into the second indoor part of the raid that it truly begins to shine. Set inside the Galaccio, World of Warcraft's art team have done a spectacular job of bringing a garish goblin casino to life, making even the battle through trash to get to the sixth boss feel like an epic journey of discovery. More than anything else, the vibe reminded me of the Golden Saucer, Final Fantasy XIV's massive casino arcade zone. This interior elevates the raid to join a very exclusive club, one shared only with Icecrown Citadel and Nyalotha, as a gameplay area that I truly wish was accessible from the outdoor world. Now, it's probably not super likely that that will ever happen, but I cannot help but think that Blizzard have a golden opportunity to reuse this space for a mini patch like 11.1.7, similar to the reuse of the Forbidden Reach or the Siren Isle map, which was originally cut content from BFA. Well, at least I guess we can hope. Sadly, at least for me personally, the final boss cinematic didn't quite match up to the rest of the story. Don't get me wrong, Gallywick's end to an industrial accident was well executed, but it kind of felt anticlimactic, leaving the heavy lifting to be done by a short prologue chapter and a capstone cinematic that did feel a lot more satisfying. The final story is unlocked by defeating Gallywick's, which for those of you who are non-raiders or whose raid team isn't up to clearing normal in week 1, can be experienced in story mode this coming reset. The clearing of the raid does bring with it another couple of important unlocks, including the campaign skip for alts. I will say that having to wait nearly 3 weeks to get access to the script feels really weird, and in my view is an avoidable miss by the developers, and one that I hope they do learn from next time around. The other major unlock is the mysterious Darkfuse Solutions cartel, which brings with it yet another reputation to progress and access to another 2 mounts, which up until now have been a little bit of a mystery. Now that we know how to get all of the available mounts, I'm going to be releasing my full mount guide for the new patch this coming Monday. If you're a mount collector, you will not want to miss that, so do hit that subscribe button and the bell icon right now before you forget, so that you know when that video goes live. This week also saw the introduction of a couple of quality of life improvements to Undermine, the first of which is that the world boss now drops a guaranteed warbound upon equipped champion gear piece that you can send to an alt from your first kill on your account every week. This item is class and spec agnostic, which makes it super useful for alt catch-up, but it also does mean that you will often get items that your main cannot use, something which this early on in the patch, when champion gear is highly desirable for pretty much everyone, feels a bit weird. The other improvements were for the scrap event. This event awards 2 mounts, one of which comes from a summonable rare, the Galaccio Garbage. This rare has a small chance to be summoned from maxing out the event's progress bar, something that was near impossible to do outside of a raid group. Add in that rare's very low chance to show up and a low drop rate for the mount, and it was fair to say that this had been the source of a lot of pushback from mount farmers. Thankfully, Blizzard did listen and have significantly increased the spawn rate along with making the bar much easier to fill. You cannot quite solo the bar yet, but I suspect that this will become possible in a few weeks once we max out the various buffs that the cartels of Undermine rep award. With the opening of the Mythic Raid, the race to World First is well underway. As has become the norm for the race, the majority of the top 10 guilds have been focusing in gearing up through heroic splits and Mythic Plus, leaving the field open for the first two bosses to fall to the US guild bound. This is pretty normal for the start of a race to World First, with the big three contenders of Liquid, Echo and Method usually only really getting their Mythic Plus campaign started a few days in. What was not usual for the race to World First though was that the final boss, Chrome King Gallywix, was defeated on Mythic difficulty on day 2 of the race. And yes, you did hear that right. Obviously, the final boss falling in just 2 days was not what anyone was expecting, and it very quickly became apparent that something was just not right with the winning guild, which consisted mainly of boosted characters using great gear. Blizzard very quickly followed up to announce that they had investigated this kill and discovered that it had been achieved using what they described as internal spells, possibly tools that are normally reserved for developers or GMs, and that they were actioning the offending accounts and the kill was being disallowed. Well, the World of Warcraft dev team will no doubt feel pretty embarrassed about this mishap. WoW is an enormously complex game, and it's never going to be possible to completely eliminate every possible corner case that motivated players could find a way to exploit. And indeed, this is not the first time that the race to World First has been disrupted by exploits in the game's history, so I don't think it's something that we should really criticise the WoW team over. Another very eye-catching issue was the mysterious appearance of a completely empty Dalaran hanging over Karazhan, and for some players a disappearing Warlords of Draenor garrison, along with crashes entering some old instances and even the zone of Argus. The sheer size and scale of World of Warcraft, along with its age, does I suspect make it infeasible to test every nook and cranny for every patch release. So to a degree, issues like this are just a fact of life for an old MMO, and I do commend the team for the speed with which they address the issues, especially the crashes. Sadly though, not all of the issues are quite so excusable, with many of the bigger realms in both North America and Europe being affected by severe server-side lag, something that isn't super unusual for new expansions, but is fairly uncommon for patch releases. And given the number of players who are likely being impacted by this problem, Blizzard's lack of any acknowledgement or update for more than a week is most definitely completely unacceptable. Add in issues with major headline features, including the disablement of warband currency transfers, broken Paragon rewards, and some Mountain Renown rewards seemingly not set up correctly, an issue that we have experienced multiple times in other recent releases, and it's clear to me that the World of Warcraft team do still have some lessons to not only learn, but to turn into concrete actions that they can use to improve the player's experience of launches in the future. With all the attention on the seasonal launch, the announcement of patch 11.15 was in some danger of falling below the radar, especially as it was a very low-key announcement, with just a short blog post providing details of the main headline features. The primary feature is called Nightfall, which I am speculating will also turn out to be the name of the patch, something that we weren't told in the update. This will see the introduction of a new faction called Flames Radiance, which we will be joining to defend the Arathi against Queen Ansarek forces, who it seems, despite her defeat, are still not ready to put down arms just yet. This is described as a public scenario where we will be split into task forces to push back the Sureki, along with a bunch of new quests and activities in the zones. This very much reminds me a lot of the Time Rifts feature from Dragonflight patch 10.15, which for me turned into the best of all of the open world events Blizzard have produced so far. But at the same time, that mention of multiple task forces does make it sound quite a bit different, almost Warfront-like, though I'm pretty sure that it's not going to turn out to be a Warfront, so I'm pretty curious to find out what it will be. No matter what, I'm certainly hoping that this is going to turn into a similar success to Time Rift. The next feature they announced is Dastardly Duos. This is going to be a new 6-week event which will launch later in the patch cycle, which will allow us to queue up to take on animatronic versions of past bosses in pairs or more, starting out with 4 bosses with more being added over time to bring it up to a total of 10. Now, when Blizzard are talking about 4 bosses going up to 10 here, I'm assuming they're meaning encounters and therefore pairs of bosses. My first reaction to this was that it sounded a little bit like a potential successor to the Brawlers Guild. However, Blizzard's update did mention that we're going to be queuing as a party, so unlike the Brawlers Guild, this is unlikely to be solo, which I think could be a little bit of a shame. The final event is Horrific Visions Revisited. This will involve us returning to the old BFA 8.3 Horrific Visions set in Stormwind and Orgrimmar, so sadly no new versions. These were Blizzard's first attempt at instance content for solo and small groups of 2 to 5 players. This update will also add some new Horrific Vision masks, which was a mechanic that added difficulty to the encounters, along with a new currency and some new and returning rewards. Solo players are also going to have the option of recruiting a construct of Sordid Army to join them as either a tank, a healer or a DPS. Quite similar, I think, to Bran and Delves. Horrific Visions was a piece of content that some players loved, but just as many players hated it. For me, the need to do a set number of visions each week at the start of 8.3.0 to rank up my legendary cloak, coupled with being forced to farm the open world content to earn a very limited number of attempts at visions, which meant that if you failed the visions more than 2 or 3 times, you'd be permanently behind for weeks, put so much pressure on me that it was impossible for me to enjoy them. Later on in patch 8.3.0, the introduction of a vendor and a new currency which opened up the ability to access the visions more freely did improve them a lot. But just as being required to run Torghast to acquire legendaries permanently tainted that content for me, that bad start meant I was never able to really settle down and enjoy doing them. This does make this a very surprising and controversial piece of content to go back to, and I'm not sure it's going to play out the way that the World of Warcraft dev team hope it will. And the lack of any new setting does make me wonder if the reaction could end up being similar to the second run of Plunderstorm, that while still popular with many players, did not seem to have the lasting power of the Plunderstorm's first outing. Thankfully, the early indications are that this time around we're going to have unlimited access to the event, and that combined with no major power rewards, data mining suggesting that gear is going to be limited to hero track, does mean that the biggest issue I had with the Horrific Visions first time around has been removed, and that perhaps will allow it to appeal a bit more widely to the player base. The last addition in the new patch is going to be the introduction of a new cooldown manager, which is designed to allow us to better track major ability cooldowns. This feature is very similar to the WeCorus based head-up display trackers that are very popular with many players, such as those offered by Luxthos and Athenar. This type of display is one of the missing functions of the default UI that does make many players continue to be dependent on add-ons in WeCorus, and so this, I think, is a very welcome addition. Unfortunately, while the new tracker is customizable in terms of position and layout, the abilities that are tracked are preset by the developers, meaning you cannot change what you want to see in the tracker. This, I suspect, does mean that players who prefer to build or customize their own WeCorus or who use highly specific versions they obtain online will be unlikely to want to switch to use the new tracker, except perhaps for the less frequently used alt. But for players who just use some pre-canned WeCorus packs or who wish to reduce their reliance on WeCorus, this could potentially be quite popular, as well as introducing the use of such trackers to a wider audience. The PTR only went live a few hours before I recorded this video, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot more discoveries that are still to be made, which as always I will be covering in my weekly updates in the weeks to come. but there is one additional unannounced feature that has already been getting some attention. On logging into the PTR, we get a brand new buff, Winds of Mysterious Fortune, which awards a 20% XP buff for leveling, along with a 200% reputation buff for Dragonflight and a 100% buff for Kaz Algar. There's no information on the timing of these buffs, but given that maxing out the Undermine cartel's reputation is estimated to take at least 20 weeks, it would not surprise me if those reputations have been tuned around this buff lasting for the full 8 weeks of this patch, and it will be very welcome for anyone who's wanting to grind out those reputation rewards. And that's all for this week's update. I'm super interested to hear your thoughts on all of this. Are you a Horrific Visions fan, or is this the return of a nightmare that you'd prefer to forget? Hit those comments and let me know. If you've enjoyed this update or maybe just found it infuriating, then please do consider supporting my channel by hitting that like icon. And if you didn't earlier, this is your last chance to remember to subscribe, which is by far the best way to support my channel. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.